Chapter 1. The Cursed Manuscript. The wind howled relentlessly across the wooded hills of São Clemente, a hidden village nestled among silent mountains, where the sounds of the big city dared not reach. There, in an old house with creaking windows and the scent of damp wood, lived Daniel Navarro, a once-renowned suspense writer who had chosen isolation after years in the spotlight of bestsellers and literary awards. Cut off from everything and everyone, he found in that solitude a haunting echo of himself. The books he had once written with feverish creativity now lay dusty on the shelves, and the blinking cursor on the blank screen mocked the paralysis of his thoughts. He hadn't published anything in 2 years. Since the accident that had taken his sister Melissa's life, Daniel had sunk into a grief so deep that words had abandoned him. The pressure from fans and his editor, Helena Vasconcelos, had become unbearable. And yet, on a stormy night that threatened to rip the roof from the trees, something changed. As if an invisible presence whispered into his ear, the words began to flow again. The story forming beneath his fingers told of a meticulous killer who left black roses beside his victims. Lonely women, all found with their eyes sewn shut, and a handwritten note containing a single line of poetry. A sinister, yet strangely poetic detail. Daniel wrote for hours, possessed by an energy he hadn't felt in years. When he completed the first chapter, the sun was already rising behind the misty mountains. A week later, a news story interrupted his routine of silence. A woman had been found murdered in an apartment in the nearby city of Campo Norte, some 50 kilometers away. The victim, a retired literature professor, had been discovered with her eyes sewn shut and a black rose by her side. On her desk, a note with a nearly identical line of poetry to the one Daniel had written. At first, he told himself it was coincidence. The crime, while disturbing, could have drawn inspiration from any number of horror films or classic thrillers. But there was more. The victim's name was the same as the character in his first chapter, Amelia Borges, a name he had chosen randomly while sipping coffee that very night. Daniel's blood turned cold. He reread the scene over and over, searching for any logical explanation. Maybe he had subconsciously picked it up from somewhere? But Amelia Borges was not a public figure. The coincidence was too exact. With trembling hands, Daniel called Helena. She listened, equal parts skeptical and concerned, as he relayed the details. She tried to calm him, suggesting he was projecting fiction onto a real-world tragedy. Told him to rest, to stop reading the news. But Daniel couldn't. Over the next few days, he compulsively monitored news sites. He created alerts, wrote down names and timelines, searching for connections. He wrote 2 more chapters, trying to steer his mind away from the sinister details, but the crimes continued. A second woman was found. Another black rose. Another poetic line. Another name pulled straight from his pages. This time, Daniel didn't call Helena. Instead, he began to investigate his own writing. He compared dates, locations, and patterns. The more he looked, the clearer it became. The murders were following his manuscript with terrifying precision. Details the press never mentioned, but which were in his story. No one else had read the book. He hadn't shared it. No one should know what would happen next. Still, it was happening. Paranoia settled in. Daniel began to suspect everyone. The postman, who always seemed to linger too long. The groundskeeper who passed by his house without reason. Even Helena, who had read early drafts months ago, now seemed suspect. But his deepest fear was something else entirely. That night, by the firelight, Daniel sat with the manuscript in hand. He remembered something he'd said years earlier in a literary interview. Words have power. Perhaps more than we imagine. Back then, it was just poetic metaphor. Now, it sounded like a curse. The question haunting him wasn't who was committing the murders, but how. Was it possible that he had somehow invoked them? The silence of the house was broken by a creak upstairs. A slow, deliberate step on old wooden floorboards. Daniel froze. The house was old, and creaks weren't uncommon. But tonight, something in the air felt different. He stood, clutching the manuscript to his chest as if it could protect him, or perhaps contain whatever was spilling out from it. At the top of the stairs, the sound stopped. Daniel stared into the darkness, heart pounding. He remembered then, the next chapter was already written. He knew who the next victim was, knew how she'd die, but he couldn't remember who he had chosen. Daniel rushes to reread what he wrote, desperate to recall the name of the next victim, and realizes, with horror, that it's someone he knows. Chapter 2. The Forgotten Name. The early morning hours crept in without mercy, carried by the cold wind that scraped against the windows and made the trees in the yard dance like nervous hands. The house, drenched in shadow, seemed to breathe with Daniel as he rushed down the stairs, chased by something unseen. In his right hand, he clutched the manuscript, now crumpled and soaked with sweat. Under the weak light of the living room lamp, his face revealed a mix of dread and disbelief. He had to know. He had to find out who the next victim was before it was too late. He threw the pages across the coffee table, spreading them out in a burst of desperation. They opened like frightened wings, revealing paragraphs he barely remembered writing. The creative flow that night had felt like a trance, a force working through him, not from him. His eyes scanned the lines furiously, searching for the right passage. He remembered the scene. The third victim, described as a young woman, a piano teacher, murdered at home while playing Chopin's nocturnes. The words were there, clear, untouched. And then he saw it. Clarice Navarro. The blood drained from his face. Clarice was his second cousin, someone he hadn't spoken to in years, but whose name had echoed in family gatherings for as long as he could remember. It wasn't a coincidence anymore. Daniel collapsed onto the couch, breath shallow. Had he chosen that name randomly? Or was his grief-stricken mind dredging up faces from his past to feed this morbid narrative? He tried to recall the last time he saw Clarice. At Melissa's funeral. She had hugged him with teary eyes, offering condolences. Since then, nothing. No messages. No calls. And yet, there she was, marked in ink. Fated to die. He fumbled for his phone and searched for her name in the news. Nothing. No headlines. No alerts. Not yet. But that didn't reassure him. He knew the killer followed the timing of his chapters. The last murder had happened 2 days ago. He had less than 48 hours. Daniel sent a frantic message to Helena, asking for Clarice's phone number. He avoided explaining why, knowing she would dismiss his concern as another paranoid spiral. While he waited, he scoured social media for any trace of his cousin. He found her quickly. Clarice lived in Taubate and taught private piano lessons from home. A recent photo showed her smiling beside a keyboard, a sheet of music open before her. The image was identical to the one he had written. When Helena finally replied with a number, Daniel hesitated. What would he say? That she was a character in a cursed story? That she was about to die unless she left her home? Still, he called. Once. Twice. 5 times. No answer. Her voicemail played with a soft voice, asking him to leave a message. He couldn't speak. He hung up and sat in silence, listening to the breath of his own panic. The next morning, he drove to Taubate under a sky of heavy clouds. The road felt endless, each passing minute stretched by dread. He arrived at Clarice's house by 11. A modest 2-story home with a carefully tended garden. He rang the bell. Nothing. Knocked again, louder. A neighbor stepped outside, and Daniel told her it was a family emergency. She said Clarice hadn't been seen since the afternoon before. Panic overtook reason. He jumped the gate, forced the front door open with a shoulder. The house was quiet, the air scented with polished wood and flowers. He moved through the living room, down a hallway, and then he saw it. In the center of the music room stood a grand piano, the same one from the photo. Sheet music was still open, and on the keys, a single black rose. Daniel screamed, the sound swallowed by the walls. Clarice lay beside the instrument, eyes closed, her face frozen in a final note of peace. By her hand, a folded note with a line of poetry, from a private letter Melissa had once written. A letter never published. A letter no one else could have seen. Police arrived 30 minutes later, called by the concerned neighbor. Daniel was taken in for questioning. Inspector Victor Resend, a seasoned officer with tired eyes, asked his questions calmly at first, but then with suspicion. 3 deaths. 3 women from Daniel's pages. And now, he had found the body himself. He tried to explain everything. The manuscript, the names, the verses. Resend listened but clearly doubted him. He warned Daniel to seek psychological help, but didn't arrest him. Not yet. That night, Daniel returned home under quiet surveillance. Now, more than ever, he was certain these weren't coincidences. Someone was following his book as if it were a script. But how? That night, he burned parts of the manuscript in the fireplace, hoping that destroying the words would stop the killings. But deep down, he knew the truth. The words had already been spoken, and words carry weight. Later, as he checked his mailbox, Daniel found another envelope. Brown. No return address. Inside was a single page, torn from his manuscript. Typed across the top. Chapter 4. The truth begins to be buried. At the bottom, signed in a delicate hand. Melissa. Daniel realizes the connection to his sister runs deeper than memory, and that someone is manipulating not only the crimes, but his grip on reality. Chapter 3. The Silent Admirer. Time bent strangely inside Daniel's home. The clock hands kept turning, but he didn't feel the hours pass. The air was thick, filled with memories, paranoia, and a creeping certainty that someone was watching. The envelope signed Melissa, which had appeared in his mailbox, didn't just shake him, it rooted a deeper fear. His sister had been dead for years. But the handwriting, the loops, the elegant pressure of the pen, he knew it too well to doubt. Melissa's death had marked the beginning of his creative decline, but now her ghost was not just a memory. It was a message. Inspector Victor Resend still kept Daniel under informal surveillance. He wasn't a suspect, officially, but the whispers had begun. Journalists, police, critics, readers. His name, once attached to best-selling thrillers, was now drifting into tabloid territory. Helena called constantly. Some days, her voice sounded genuinely concerned. Other times, she urged him to take a break, to stop digging. She said he was spiraling. But Daniel felt it differently. The crimes weren't just echoing his fiction. They were responding to it. The turning point came on the day of Clarice's funeral. Helena had arranged a discreet book signing event in São José dos Campos, hoping to pull Daniel out of isolation. She insisted it would help distract him. He agreed reluctantly, more out of fatigue than hope. The bookstore was small, independent, filled with long-time readers. Daniel signed copies, offered forced smiles, and tried to suppress the paranoia gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. And then he saw him. A young man, tall and thin, with disheveled dark hair and a wrinkled plaid shirt, approached the table. His eyes glistened with something between admiration and hunger. In his hands, he held a worn-out copy of Whispers in the Mist, one of Daniel's earliest novels. He introduced himself as Lucas Tavares, a literature student and aspiring writer. Claimed to have been a fan since adolescence. Quoted lines from obscure books, scenes long forgotten by most readers. Daniel was impressed. This wasn't just a fan. It was a scholar of his work. But something in Lucas's eyes unsettled him. A kind of gleam. Too intense. Too knowing. Then came the sentence. Lucas smiled and said, "The new project is darker, but it's your most authentic work yet." Daniel froze. No one had read his new manuscript. Not even Helena. He hadn't posted anything publicly. The draft was unfinished, unpublished, unshared. But Lucas knew. Before he could react, Lucas walked away, vanishing into the crowd. That night, Daniel scoured his digital files. He checked cloud storage, past emails, anything that might have been exposed. Weeks ago, he recalled, his email had been infected with a minor virus. He hadn't paid attention then. Now, he wondered, had someone accessed his drafts? Obsessed, he turned to the internet, to forgotten blogs and literary forums. Buried deep in a dusty thread of a suspense community, he found a user called Melissa Alive, who had been posting excerpts and poetic musings that matched his manuscript. The posts weren't just similar, they were identical to passages he'd written. And worse, a recent comment included the name of the next victim, someone Daniel had only added to the draft that very morning. This wasn't a coincidence. He wasn't imagining it. Someone had access to his mind, or his files. And whoever it was, they weren't just copying. They were building something alongside him. Daniel took everything to Inspector Resend. The forum posts, the usernames, the writing patterns. Resend listened, skeptical but disturbed. He promised to get a cybercrime team to investigate the IP addresses, but he warned Daniel, unless another victim appeared, there was little the law could do with speculative fiction. But a new victim had already been written, and soon she would be found. That evening, another envelope arrived, this time slipped under his door. Inside was a black and white photograph. It showed Daniel himself, asleep on the couch in his living room. The manuscript lay beside him. At the bottom, written in red ink, "You write, I execute." Daniel realizes that someone is not just inspired by his work, they are co-authoring it. Watching, reading, acting. The line between fiction and reality begins to collapse. A new murder takes place, and this time, Daniel learns that the killer isn't just rewriting his book, but rewriting his past. Chapter 4. The Shadow Author. Dawn arrived wrapped in thick fog, as if the outside world were trying to hide the next chapter from human eyes. Daniel had barely slept. The black and white photo of himself, captured while unconscious, clung to his thoughts like a parasite. The message in red ink still echoed in his mind. "You write, I execute." Paranoia had transformed into certainty. Someone was watching him. This person not only knew his routines but also his manuscript, down to details that hadn't been shared with anyone. Worse yet, this person understood Daniel's fears. The killer wasn't just a fan. He was a co-creator. Daniel couldn't stay in the house any longer. He drove aimlessly until he stopped at a quiet cafe on a corner in the city center. Sitting at the back, facing the window, he opened his laptop and logged into the same forum where the user Melissa Alive had been posting. There was a new message. The post was titled, "Next Chapter, Live Release in 24 Hours." The content was a cryptic poem about a body floating in dark waters, eyes open to the sky, fingers stiff like wet feathers. At the bottom, a name, Juliana Camargo. Daniel didn't recognize the name at first. A quick search revealed she was a cultural journalist, host of a literary podcast, someone who had once harshly criticized one of his final published books. He found the review, "The Fall of a Master of Suspense." He clenched his jaw. The killer wasn't just following the manuscript anymore. He was choosing victims from Daniel's life. People connected to his past. People who had made him feel exposed or vulnerable. Daniel rushed to the police again, showing Resend the new post. The inspector, now taking him more seriously, ordered that Juliana receive protective detail. But red tape slowed everything. Bureaucracy moved at the pace of paperwork, while the killer followed the ticking of a private clock. Unwilling to wait, Daniel tracked Juliana down himself. He found her near the recording studio of her podcast. When he approached, she was wary, suspicious. She recognized him immediately. How could she not? A famous author now tangled in murders. He tried to explain that her name had appeared in a prediction, that she was in danger, that it wasn't fiction. She didn't believe him until he showed her the post. Then her expression shifted. They sat in a cafe nearby. Daniel poured everything out: the book, the murders, the roses, the poetry, Lucas. Juliana listened, skeptical but slowly unraveling. Then she froze. Her eyes locked on a figure outside the window. Daniel turned. Lucas Tavares. He stood across the street, staring through the glass. His expression was blank. When Daniel met his gaze, Lucas turned and walked away, leaving something behind on a nearby table. A single sheet of paper, typed across the top. Juliana will be the turning point. She will dig up what the author tried to bury. Juliana, shaken, finally told Daniel the truth. Melissa had come to her months before her death. She had wanted to expose something about Daniel, something troubling. According to Juliana, Melissa claimed that Daniel believed his words had power. That when he wrote, reality began to change. That characters stepped off the page. That some stories refused to remain fiction. Juliana had recorded the interview, but never aired it. Together, they retrieved the old file. The recording played on a handheld device, Melissa's voice fragile and distant. Sometimes, I feel like I'm not myself, like someone else is writing me. If one day I disappear, tell him he wrote me out. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. This wasn't just about murder. It was about memory, about control, about guilt. Juliana agreed to accept police protection. That night, Daniel returned home. But the sense of being watched no longer came just from outside. It came from the words, from the manuscript. He reopened the file and found a new page, one he hadn't written. It read, Chapter 5, The writer wakes up at his own crime scene. Daniel is accused of a new murder. This time, the crime scene is inside his own house. And he is the only suspect. Chapter 5, At the Heart of the Maze. The following morning arrived like a silent sentence. The sky hung low and gray, stretching endlessly over the hills. Inside Daniel's home, the manuscript still lay on his desk, untouched since the night before. But the new page, the one he didn't remember writing, was still there, as if it had always belonged to the story. Chapter 5, The writer wakes up at his own crime scene. The phrase echoed in his mind like a curse, each word weighed down with dread. He couldn't recall writing it. The formatting, the tone, the voice, it was unmistakably his. But the intention, the memory, they weren't. It was like someone had slipped into his mind, written through his hands. He tried to shake the paranoia off, convincing himself it was exhaustion. He locked himself in his room to rest. But just before dawn, a sharp noise from downstairs startled him awake. The clock read 4:26 a.m. The house was silent, but heavy, as if holding its breath. Daniel grabbed a lamp as an improvised weapon and crept down the stairs, barefoot on the carpeted hallway. The silence was alive. It wasn't just absence of noise, it was waiting. Nothing seemed out of place at first. But then he saw it. A trail of black petals, scattered in a slow curve across the floor, leading to the library, the oldest, most secluded room in the house. His heart pounded. He pushed open the door and froze. In the center of the library, on the Moroccan rug, lay the body of a man. A stranger. His face was partially covered by a dark cloth mask, his eyes wide open in a frozen expression of pain or shock. Beside him, as always, a black rose. And a note, typed, pinned to his coat. Every story needs a martyr, and every martyr needs an author. Daniel staggered back. Panic took over. He had no idea who the man was or how he had entered the house. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, nothing. And yet, here was a murder scene in his home. He reached out, hesitated. His fingerprints would be everywhere. He knew what this looked like. It was an elegant, cruel trap. He called Inspector Resend immediately. The officer answered with a groggy voice that turned sharp the moment he heard the word body. Within the hour, Daniel's home was filled with investigators, technicians, and eventually, reporters. He was taken to the police station, questioned, inspected, scrutinized. Resend's tone was colder than ever. Now, there was no more benefit of the doubt. 3 dead women were tied to Daniel's manuscript. And now, a man, murdered in the writer's own home, under the exact signature of the killer's poetic style. Daniel explained everything again. The photos, the notes, the page that wrote itself. Resend listened, but this time, suspicion outweighed belief. They didn't arrest him yet. But Daniel was officially declared the primary suspect. Then something unexpected happened. A new envelope arrived, delivered straight to Resend, from an anonymous courier. Inside was a photo. It showed the same murdered man, still alive, sitting in Daniel's library, calmly reading the manuscript. The photo had been printed that very morning. If Daniel had been asleep, unaware of the man's presence, who took the photo? The narrative began to shift. Still, Daniel was kept in holding for further questioning. That night, alone in his cell, he replayed every word he had written, over and over, looking for patterns, for codes, for truth. And he realized something terrifying. The murders weren't just following the manuscript. The murders were shaping it. The killer wasn't just acting out Daniel's ideas. He was using them, feeding off them, writing through them. Daniel wasn't telling a story anymore. He was being written. The next morning, Helena visited him, bringing a folder with documents and a new message, another printed post from Melissa alive. The final chapter begins when the writer realizes he was never writing alone. Daniel's hands trembled as he read the line. This wasn't a follower. This wasn't an imitator. This was a co-author. Daniel uncovers new secrets about his sister's death, and learns that the killer has been crafting this story for much longer than anyone imagined. Chapter 6. Melissa's Last Letter. The sound of the prison gate slamming shut didn't hit Daniel as hard as he had imagined. It didn't feel like the end. It felt like a new chapter, one he hadn't written. The air in the cell was heavy with mold and old metal. The cot creaked. The walls echoed distant footsteps. But Daniel's mind was louder than all of it. The envelope Helena had delivered, the one signed Melissa, still burned in his thoughts. The final chapter begins when the writer realizes he was never writing alone. That line no longer felt symbolic. It was a key, a confession, a warning, and maybe a beginning. Inspector Resend had Daniel under preventive detention. Though his innocence hadn't been ruled out, the coincidence of a murder inside his home and his increasingly erratic behavior was too much to overlook. But that morning, something changed everything. Helena returned to the prison, this time carrying a USB drive and a thick folder of documents. She had used her connections in the publishing industry to dig into something forgotten, the official investigation into Melissa Navarro's death. The case, long closed, had been ruled a suicide. But now, Helena had found inconsistencies. 3 weeks before her death, Melissa had sent an anonymous report to a small literary magazine. In it, she accused her brother, Daniel, of being dangerously delusional. She described what she called narrative transference, a bizarre theory that stories, when written with enough emotional intensity, could begin to affect reality. She claimed Daniel didn't understand the power he had, that he wasn't just writing fiction. He was creating blueprints for something more dangerous. The editors dismissed the letter. No article was published, and Melissa was never contacted again. 3 weeks later, her body was found in a lake. Daniel's heart sank as Helena showed him another document, a minor police report from the same night Melissa died. It mentioned a young man arrested for trespassing on a property near the lake. Lucas Tavares. His name had never appeared in the investigation. No connection was ever made. Until now. Daniel sat in silence. The weight of truth settled on his chest. Lucas had been there. He hadn't just admired Melissa. He had known her, influenced her, or worse, led her. Helena handed him the USB drive. On it were archived posts from the Melissa Alive forum. Daniel opened them on a guarded laptop in the visitation room. The writing style was disturbingly familiar. The patterns, the rhythm, the phrasing. It matched an old blog from years ago, Feather and Ink, a forgotten literary site by a teenage Lucas Tavares. Lucas wasn't just obsessed. He had been building this story long before the murders started. 4 years. He had studied Daniel's works, mimicked his voice, infiltrated his world. And Melissa. She had written about her fears to Juliana, but there was something more. In one of her private journal entries, retrieved from an old notebook Helena had recovered, Melissa wrote, "He says I'm not real. That I'm a character my brother created. Sometimes, I believe him." Daniel's hands shook as he read it. Lucas had done this to her. Not with violence, but with words, with manipulation, with doubt. He had convinced Melissa that she didn't exist outside of Daniel's books, and she had drowned in that belief. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling of his cell and saw the pieces fitting together. Lucas wasn't just a fan. He was a ghostwriter, a predator hiding behind admiration. But Daniel still had one weapon: his words. By morning, he began writing, not a new chapter, but a trap. He described a fake scene, a staged crime, a name, a location, a time. He would lead Lucas there, and he would end this story. Daniel learns that Lucas manipulated Melissa before her death and has been crafting a parallel narrative for years. Now, Daniel writes one final page, with the power to trap the true author of death. Lucas takes the bait. The final confrontation is near, and only one author will be left to finish the story. Chapter 7, Blood on the Page. Now more than ever, Daniel knew, words carried weight. He wrote each line with the precision of a trap builder. Not a chapter, but a map. A scene carefully composed to draw in the predator who had been co-authoring his life. The setup was simple. A fake crime. A fake victim. A real location. He described it in detail. An abandoned warehouse on the edge of BR 394. In the draft, he claimed a final murder would take place there, a poetic ritual of closure. He included references only a devoted reader would understand. Left clues embedded in metaphor. And at the heart of it, a name, Raoul, a discarded character from an unpublished manuscript. He knew Lucas would recognize it. And he knew Lucas would come. Daniel handed the page to a visiting journalist under the pretense of it being a confession. The journalist posted it online, where the Melissa Alive account would see it. By nightfall, the trap had been set. Inspector Resend, still skeptical but growing desperate, agreed to the plan. Daniel was released under surveillance, followed by unmarked police vehicles. For the first time in weeks, Daniel walked freely, but he was not free. He was bait. The warehouse stood like a corpse beneath the cloudy sky, its rusted metal siding creaking in the wind. Inside, Daniel recreated the scene exactly as written. A mannequin dressed in bloodied clothes, pages of the manuscript scattered like ritual offerings, candles casting trembling shadows across the concrete floor. He waited. Time crawled. The wind moaned through cracks in the structure. And then, footsteps. Measured. Intentional. Lucas Tavares emerged from the dark like an actor taking the stage. He wore a black coat, gloves, carried a small video camera in one hand. He wasn't surprised to see Daniel. He smiled, said softly, "You did it." The final scene. Daniel said nothing. He stepped back slowly, drawing Lucas into the center of the trap. Lucas knelt beside the mannequin, examining it like a director reviewing props. He didn't see the movement around him. But Daniel did. Flashlights flared from hidden corners. Shouts erupted. Police emerged from the shadows. "Hands where we can see them." Lucas stood motionless, the smile never leaving his lips. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply said, "I just finished the story she started." Back at the station, Lucas confessed everything. Each murder. Each rose. Each verse. He described the plot as if narrating a novel, Daniel's novel. Said Melissa was his inspiration. That she'd told him Daniel's words had power. That she wanted out of her story. Lucas had promised her an escape. When she died, he picked up the pen. He said, "I wanted Daniel to feel it. To know what it's like to be written. To be manipulated. To lose control." Daniel listened in silence. Not with anger, but with finality. He no longer saw a fan or a killer. He saw a boy who had fallen into a story too deep and dragged others in with him. In the days that followed, the case exploded in the media. Daniel's innocence was confirmed. Lucas was charged on multiple counts. The Melissa Alive forum vanished. And Daniel returned to his home, where it all began. The rooms were quieter now. The shadows calmer. The manuscript no longer haunted the desk. Daniel didn't write. He walked. He breathed. He existed. And then one day, he sat by the fire and opened a blank document. At the top, he typed, "The words that kill." And beneath it, "This is not the story of a killer, but of a writer who had to lose control to understand the value of silence." He didn't know if he would publish it. Maybe it would stay just for him. But the story, finally, was his. Daniel traps Lucas in a staged murder scene. The killer is arrested, and all is revealed. His obsession, his manipulation of Melissa, and his attempt to control Daniel's story. With the truth exposed and justice served, Daniel must face the question that haunts all authors. Will he ever write again? Chapter 8. Silence Between the Lines. The weeks following Lucas Tavares's arrest passed like fog, slow, colorless, heavy. The newspapers finally stopped printing headlines about the killings. The public shifted focus to the next scandal. The forums went dark. Melissa Alive was deleted. But inside Daniel Navarro, the silence was not peace. It was weight. Not absence of noise, but the echo of everything he had lived. He was no longer a suspect. His name was cleared. The law had done its part. But what haunted him was not legal, it was literary. Lucas had confessed in full. The courts had enough to lock him away for decades. He was a killer, a manipulator, a ghost in Daniel's pages. But Daniel, he had authored the story. He hadn't wielded the knife. But he had opened the door. For days, he avoided his desk. Walked through the woods behind his house. Listened to the wind through the trees, the birds, the subtle rhythm of the world. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to describe it. He simply experienced it. On one of those walks, he found something curious beneath a fallen log, a red notebook, weathered and damp, hidden beneath leaves. Inside were water-stained pages filled with familiar handwriting. Melissa's. It was her journal. In it, she wrote of fear and dreams, of feeling like her life was a narrative not her own. But she also wrote of Daniel, not with blame, but with love, with understanding. Daniel bleeds so others don't have to. He doesn't write to kill, he writes to trap the monsters on the page. He read those words over and over, letting them heal. She had believed in him, even when she was afraid, even when the world around her was unraveling. She had seen him for what he truly was, not a destroyer, but a storyteller. That night, by the fireplace, Daniel sat at his desk. The air was still. No petals, no whispers, just the sound of fire cracking. He opened his laptop and began to write. No contracts, no deadlines, just him and the words. He typed a title, "The Words That Kill," and beneath it, "This is not the story of a killer, but of a writer who had to lose control to understand the value of silence." He didn't know if anyone would read it, but it didn't matter. The story had already saved him. Days later, he received a package. No return address. Inside, a single printed page. It read, "Epilogue. When the author stops writing, the story sleeps." He smiled. Lucas still wanted to play, but the story was over. He walked into the yard, the red notebook in hand, and buried both the page and Melissa's journal beneath the tree she had loved as a child. The ground accepted it, and with it, the ghosts.